Hi, my name is Kevin Dunn, and I'm only sort of happy to be making this video recording of a presentation to give for the 2020 HSCG conference. I would love to have seen you guys in person under happier circumstances. I've also changed my topic. I was going to be giving a presentation called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly about different kinds of soap and the problems that we face. But given the circumstances of this non-real life meeting, I'm going to talk about the chemistry of the coronavirus pandemic that we're currently in. I want to acknowledge some people before I get started. Derek Hodges at Essential Depot has done fantastic work supporting my research over the years. I'm very grateful to him for all that he's done for me and my students over the years. I'm also grateful to Hampton-Sydney College, a college that has continued to employ me even though I've turned out to be somewhat of a, let's say, an iconoclast. I'm very grateful to their support in the kind of research that I've been doing. The slides without the audio will be posted to my website at cavemanchemistry.com/CoronaChem2020.ppt, so you can download it from there. In this presentation, we'll learn what is the public health response to the coronavirus pandemic. We'll talk about soap and personal hygiene. We'll talk about hand sanitizers. And finally, we'll talk about a little bit about virus chemistry, in particular the chemistry of the coronavirus and its interaction with soap and hand sanitizers. I have to give you a little bit of a disclaimer here. I am not a physician, so I'm not dispensing medical advice. If you need medical advice, consult a licensed physician. I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't study things like global pandemics as part of my ordinary research. I'm not a virologist, so I don't really study viruses. And I'm not a public health official, so you don't really have to listen to or pay attention to anything I say. Given all these disclaimers, why on earth am I making this video? The answer is that I am a chemist, and I can talk about the chemical aspects of soap and its interaction with virus, but I'm not an expert in any of the things that I've already disclaimed. Needless to say, we're in a global pandemic. There are two phrases that I want to touch on before we get started. One is you'll hear the term coronavirus disease or COVID-19. This refers to the disease of people getting sick and getting pneumonia and all of the associated bad things that happen to human bodies when they get this disease. Separate from that, there's the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2. That's the name of the virus that causes the disease COVID-19. So we make a distinction between the disease and the virus that causes the disease. The public health response to this pandemic has been social distancing. We're encouraged not to gather in large crowds, and when we gather, to keep a distance of 6 feet between people. The primary means of dispersing the coronavirus is by droplets that are expelled when you cough or sneeze, or even possibly when you talk. Water droplets dispersed into the air carry the coronavirus. It either lands on our hands and then we touch our face and mouth and ingest it that way, or we inhale water droplets and then the coronavirus gets into our body by that route. We're also encouraged to frequently wash our hands, and the bulk of this presentation will be about that. We're also encouraged to use hand sanitizer. Whenever frequent hand washing is not an option, hand sanitizer is the next best thing. So for hand washing, in previous presentations, I'm always giving the results of my own research, but in this one, as I've said, I'm not an expert in most of these things. So a lot of the information I'm giving you is things that I've gleaned from searching the internet. I'm giving you all the references to the places that I found. This particular article talks about hand washing. It precedes the coronavirus pandemic, talked about hand washing in general and what hand washing does for us. It claimed that after 15 seconds of washing with soap and water, you'll remove 90% of the germs from your hand. That's important because, on average, most people prior to the pandemic, when they washed their hands for 5 seconds. And the suggestion here is that 15 or 20 seconds is a better time for washing your hands to remove things like germs from them. If you want to time, the trick that I learned was if you sing yourself the happy birthday song twice while you're washing your hands, that gives you about the right amount of time. 30 seconds removes 99.9% of germs. So between 15 and 30 seconds is a good amount of time to wash your hands. This particular reference recommends soap over hand sanitizers being the next best thing when soap and water are not available. What about antibacterial soaps? For that, I turned to the Centers for Disease Control. This was an article on the CDC website. It made 3 points. The majority of antibacterial soap uses triclosan as the antibacterial agent. It's present only in small quantities, and the CDC study showed that triclosan by itself is more effective against bacteria than it is in the presence of soap. In other words, soap interferes with the ability of triclosan to kill bacteria. Furthermore, triclosan in antibacterial soap can foster antibiotic resistance. That is, it kills some bacteria, but the ones that it doesn't kill are the ones that were resistant to triclosan. And then those bacteria go on to multiply, and they give us a bacterial strain that's resistant to triclosan as an antibacterial. So the CDC is not in favor of antibacterial soap because they believe it fosters antibiotic resistance. The third point they make is that the use of antibacterial soap may increase allergies among people. And the study they did was they studied households that used antibacterial soap and didn't use antibacterial soap. And they found that the children that grew up using antibacterial soap had more allergies than children that grew up with ordinary soap and water, that is, not antibacterial soap. The mechanism that they think is at work is that when children have their immune system challenged by small levels of benign bacteria, that strengthens their immune system and that they are less susceptible to allergies. The point that is not made in this article, because it's not specific to coronavirus, but just to antibacterials in general, is that an antibacterial works against bacteria. It doesn't work at all against viruses. So an antibacterial soap, it's still going to be soap. It's going to be effective against viruses because it's soap, but it's not going to be extra effective against viruses because viruses are not susceptible to the same antibiotics that are used against bacteria. I'm going to talk about hand sanitizer now. Normally, hand sanitizer is produced by pharmaceutical companies. It's an over-the-counter pharmaceutical. It's considered that. And The reason is that a hand sanitizer claims to kill germs. Because it claims to kill germs, that's a health-related claim. And so in order to make that claim, you have to be a pharmaceutical company. But in response to the coronavirus pandemic, the FDA has softened those restrictions. This is the flyer from the FDA that you can download, and it gives permission, temporary authorization to compound hand sanitizer, not to just any Tom, Dick, and Harry, but specifically to pharmacists. Pharmacists are allowed to temporarily compound hand sanitizer because of the shortages of hand sanitizer from the over-the-counter pharmaceutical market. There are some distilleries and cosmetic producers that have asked for permission and been granted permission from the FDA, but this doesn't come automatically. And so rather than just jumping into the hand sanitizer product, I would encourage soap and cosmetic producers to stick to soap unless you want to go through the whatever regulatory hurdles there are for producing hand sanitizer. That said, if you want to produce hand sanitizer, the FDA gives you the recipe that they're authorizing pharmacists to make. It's principally alcohol. It's either ethanol, which is grain alcohol, or it's isopropyl alcohol, which is rubbing alcohol. 80% grain alcohol or 75% isopropyl alcohol on a volume-to-volume basis. In addition to that, you're going to add 1.45% glycerin and 0.125% on a volume-volume basis of hydrogen peroxide. Whatever's left, whatever up to 25% that's left, is going to be made up of sterile water. You mix those things up and you have FDA-approved hand sanitizer if you're a pharmacist, or if you've specifically gotten permission from the FDA to produce hand sanitizer for the public. All right, we're going to skip to general virology now. I found a really good source on virology at this website. The Khan Academy also has an excellent high school biology level introduction to viruses. And so I'm accessing information from those two websites. So first thing I want to touch on is the difference between a virus and a bacterium. A bacterium is a living organism. It does things like move around, it eats things, it poops things, it has a metabolism. It does all the things that living things do. In addition to all of those other things, it also reproduces. So when it gets into your body, whether it's a disease-causing bacterium or a benign bacterium, it will eat things in your body. There might be things floating around in your bloodstream or on your skin or wherever. It eats things, it has a metabolism, it excretes waste products, it moves around by a variety of different means, and it has a full and active life. A virus, on the other hand, is not alive. It's technically not a living thing. It's only genetic material that's capable of reproducing. It has, unlike a bacterium, it has no ability to reproduce on its own. The only way that it can reproduce is to get into a host cell and use the genetic machinery of that cell, ordinarily used for that cell's own purposes. It hijacks the genetic machinery in order to make multiple copies of itself. This most often results in cell death. When the cell dies, it rips open, and all the viruses that were reproduced spill out into whatever the environment is, and then possibly attach themselves to a new host cell and go through the process all over again. Viruses are generally smaller than bacteria and other microorganisms. Some of them are really tiny. The largest of them is still smaller than the smallest bacterium. The coronavirus is about 125 nanometers across in diameter, and that puts it about the same size level as the HIV virus. That's not to say that the two viruses are related, not at all. It's just that they're about the same size. There are viruses that are smaller than the coronavirus. There are viruses that are larger than the coronavirus. But the coronavirus is about smack in the middle of viruses as far as size goes. There are different types of virus. The most common is a non-enveloped virus. It consists of a protein shell called a capsid and a genetic material called the genome that lives inside the capsid. The capsid is a protective cover, if you will, for the genome. The genome is the part of the virus that actually reproduces inside the cell. There's also an enveloped virus. An enveloped virus has a lipid film around it, as most cells do, the living cells like bacteria and the cells of your own body. The cells are surrounded by a lipid membrane. An enveloped virus steals a bit of that lipid membrane from its host cell and wraps it up in a cloak of this lipid bilayer. It still has a capsid, a protein shell inside of it, and buried inside is the genome, the part of the cell the part of the virus that's actually going to reproduce. Sticking out of the lipid bilayer, the lipid membrane, are some surface proteins or spikes. You've seen this in all the pictures on the news. These spikes are what's responsible for allowing the virus to attach to the host cell. There's also an enveloped virus with a helical capsid. The coronavirus is this type. It has more of a, instead of a soccer ball kind of a capsid, it has a helical capsid. And inside that is a single-stranded RNA genome. That's the part of the virus that's responsible for reproduction. In our bodies, reproduction is governed by DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. In our cells use RNA, ribonucleic acid, as an intermediate between the reproductive function of DNA and the protein synthesis function of RNA. The coronavirus is an RNA type of virus. It doesn't have DNA. It has only RNA, and that's the part of the genetic material which is responsible for directing protein synthesis. So here's a close-up of an enveloped virus. We see the linear single-stranded RNA surrounded by a helical protein capsid. Outside of that is a lipid bilayer membrane, and sticking out of the lipid bilayer membrane are surface proteins that are responsible for attaching the virus to the host cell. This is an electron micrograph of an actual SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. You can see that it's basically round. The genetic material is on the interior. The lipid bilayer is at the surface, and you can see the protein spikes sticking out of it. Now I'm going to go through a little background chemistry because, after all, I'm a chemist, and that's the thing that I'm actually an expert in, unlike the other things that I've told you so far. One might wonder if Kevin Dunn is capable of giving a presentation without talking about nerds and cheerleaders. So the basic chemistry is that oil and water don't mix. Most cells are watery on the inside and they're oily on the outside. They have a membrane that separates the watery inside from the watery outside. The lipid bilayer membrane separates those two regions. Oil and lye react to make soap. Like dissolves like. So So soap has properties of both oil and water, and it's capable of emulsifying oils and getting them to go into a suspension in water. So this is a typical oil molecule and two typical water molecules. The oil molecule, I've colored green. Green, you can think of it as green and greasy. It's oily. The two water molecules are color-coded white for a positive charge and red for a negative charge. In this case, the hydrogen atoms are positively charged. The oxygen atom is negatively charged. We all know the formula of water is H2O. Here we see two hydrogen atoms bonded to an oxygen atom. And what I've shown you is two water molecules next to each other. In each case, like charges repel each other and opposite charges attract. So the white positive hydrogen atoms of one water molecule are attracted to the red negative end of the oxygen atom on the other water molecule. Positive charges attracted to negative charges. The oil molecule is mostly made of carbon and hydrogen. Carbon and hydrogen share charge equally. And so the oil molecule is neither red, it's not negatively charged, nor is it white, it's not positively charged. It's roughly neutral. So a neutrally charged molecule or a non-polar molecule is colored green. A polar molecule like water is colored red and white. You couldn't escape from nerds and cheerleaders. If you're seeing me for the first time, this will be brand new. If you've been to any of my presentations in the last decade, you know I always talk about nerds and cheerleaders because it's a great analogy for the way oil and water behave. So if you've seen my presentations before, you can just fast forward to the next 5 or 10 minutes of presentation, but if you've never seen it before, people tend to sit through it over and over again because they find it enlightening and amusing. The notion is that in high school cafeterias all across the known universe, nerds and cheerleaders are having lunch. And there are two kinds of tables in the cafeteria. There are the tables where the nerds are hanging out and the tables where the cheerleaders are hanging out. Now you might imagine that nerds hate cheerleaders, and so that's why they sit together. But nothing could be further from the truth. I was a nerd in high school, and I found the cheerleaders enormously attractive. You might think that the cheerleaders hate the nerds, and that's why they all sit together and the nerds are excluded, but that's not true either. Individual cheerleaders, I had good relationships with them. And it's only in the aggregate, when cheerleaders get together, let's imagine a table of cheerleaders and an empty seat. If a nerd comes to sit in that seat, every cheerleader at the table can't help but think, could have been another cheerleader sitting there. So it isn't that they hate the nerd, they just have a slight preference for other cheerleaders, and so cheerleaders tend to sit together because they're more attracted to one another than they are to nerds. You might ask if something similar is going on with the nerds. Do the nerds sit together because they have a slight preference for other nerds? And the answer is no. Nerds love cheerleaders. The only reason they sit together is because there's no place left to sit. The nerds sit together because they're sitting in the places where cheerleaders aren't sitting already. Now, I showed you an oil molecule, but the oil molecule I showed previously was the kind of oil that you would find in motor oil or gasoline or petroleum jelly. This is our kind of oil. This is the kind of oil that you find in vegetable oils or animal fats. It's a triacyl glyceride or a triglyceride for short. This particular one is glyceryl trilaurate. It's the kind of molecule that you would find most frequently in coconut oil. And you can see that while it has some white to it, it's mostly green. And we remember green is greasy. This is a non-polar molecule, not very attracted to water molecules. And so in the nerd cheerleader analogy, this is a nerdy kind of molecule. This is a molecule that's not much attracted to other molecules because it lacks strong positive and negative charges. By contrast, this is a very polar molecule, sodium hydroxide. Soap makers are familiar with this because we use this to make soap from oil and fat. Sodium hydroxide molecule looks very similar to a water molecule. It's got a positively charged nitrogen atom, a negatively charged oxygen atom, and a positively charged hydrogen atom. Here I've shown a water molecule next to a sodium hydroxide molecule, and you can see that the ball that's detached, that's the sodium ion, sitting next to the OH, which is the hydroxide ion, and it's the positively charged sodium ion which is attracted to the negatively charged oxygen atom on a neighboring water molecule. So you can imagine sodium hydroxide and water interact strongly. Sodium hydroxide is very soluble in water because the positively charged sodium ion is so attracted to the negatively charged oxygen atom on water molecules. We have some names for this. Anything that's got a positive charge, we call a cation. It's not a cation. You'll be able to distinguish yourself when you talk to other chemists by talking about cations. And the negatively charged ion is an anion. Cation is a positively charged ion, anion is a negatively charged ion, and ion is something that carries a net positive or negative charge. So, this is solvated sodium hydroxide. When sodium hydroxide gets in the vicinity of water molecules, the positively charged sodium ion is attracted to water molecules, particularly the negatively charged oxygen on the water molecules. And the leftover bit, the hydroxide ion, also attracted to water molecules, but to the opposite end. The anion is attracted to the positively charged hydrogen atoms on neighboring water molecules. You can think of this as the captain of the football team. So here we have captain of the football team, the positively charged sodium ion, being surrounded by a harem of positive and negatively charged water molecules, or captain of the football team surrounded by a harem of cheerleaders. We're now going to take an oil molecule, which is not positively and negatively charged. It's roughly neutral or nonpolar, and we're going to react it with 3 hydroxide ions. The structure of this oil molecule is a triacylglyceride, and you can see the tri comes from the 3 nonpolar groups that are hanging off of the center part of the molecule. These hydroxide ions are going to attack the triacylglyceride one ion at a time, and they make a noise when they do it. People who have seen this before will make the noise with me. Dink. That's the sound of one hydroxide ion attacking that positively charged carbon atom in the center, the white colored atom in the center, and it actually cuts off one of the 3 fatty acid groups. And now I've got on the left, looking like a caterpillar with 2 big red eyes, is a soap molecule. You can see the soap molecule has 2 parts. It has the tail, which is green and greasy, and it has the head, which has a white atom and 2 red atoms. If you remember what the water molecule looked like, it was a red atom with 2 white atoms. So one end of the molecule is positively and negatively charged like a water molecule. The other end is green and greasy. What's left behind is the 2 other fingers of the 3-fingered triacylglyceride. That's now called a diacylglyceride or a diglyceride. Now another hydroxide ion is going to come in. You can see him eyeballing that white carbon atom, negatively charged red hydroxide ion attracted to the positively charged white carbon atom, and it's going to, here it goes. Dink. Another hydroxide ion is gone, attached to another amputated finger of our little three-fingered molecule. Now 2 soap molecules, and what do you think we should call that remaining piece? That's right, a monoacylglyceride or a monoglyceride. One more hydroxide ion to go, and you're now ready for it. Dink, there's the noise that it made. And now I have 3 soap molecules, and the knuckle where the 3 fingers used to be attached is glycerin, also known as glycerol, and you can see that it has red and white atoms, so you can imagine glycerol or glycerin is very soluble in water. Similarly, the soap molecules, one end of the molecule is going to be strongly attracted to water molecules, and the other end, not so much. Close up, this is what a soap molecule looks like. It's got that green hydrophobic tail, the red and white hydrophilic head, and I've shown the white ball hanging out by itself is the sodium ion. The rest of that is called the laurate ion. So the sodium ion and the laurate ion together make up the soap, sodium laurate. Again, the white atom on its own is a cation, and the big rest of the molecule, which has a net negative charge, you can see there are 2 red atoms and 1 white atom. So net, this has a net negative charge. It's an anion. And we refer to this soap as an anionic surfactant because it's a surfactant in which the active part of it is an anion or a negatively charged ion. Has a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. When I get soap in the vicinity of water, it solvates. The water molecules make off with the sodium ion. The captain of the football team retires, surrounded by a harem of water molecules. And the soap molecule, the soap ion, the anionic surfactant, is left with the water molecules at the hydrophilic end, but not at the hydrophobic end. You get 2 soap molecules together and they will line up. The 2 hydrophilic watery heads are going to be attracted to water molecules on the outside, and the 2 hydrophobic nerdy tails are going to be left wherever the water molecules aren't, that is, in the middle. So in essence, the 2 hydrophobic tails are going to line up together, leaving the hydrophilic heads on the outside. If you get more than 2 molecules together, they round up like a wagon train, they circle the wagons. That gives me a fatty interior and a watery or hydrophilic exterior. Here's what happens with more water molecule, more soap molecules. And finally, this is what a ball looks like. When we get a bunch of soap molecules together, they're going to organize into a structure with all the hydrophobic tails in the interior and all the hydrophilic heads on the exterior. That structure is called a micelle. So when soap goes into water, it organizes itself into a structure called a micelle. Watery on the outside, fatty on the inside. Well, what does all this have to do with a virus? This is a model of the coronavirus, and you can see, as we talked about before, what you're looking at here in red are the proteins that are sticking out of the membrane. The membrane, the lipid bilayer membrane, is shown in gray here. And for scale, our soap micelles are much smaller than the virus is. As small as the virus is, the micelles are even smaller. What they're going to do is to attack that lipid membrane. And just like they would do with any kind of greasy material, they're going to emulsify it so that it can go down the drain. That's going to leave the virus without the lipid membrane, and the lipid membrane is the thing that's holding the whole thing together. With the lipid membrane removed, the proteins are just going to be floating around in solution, and the DNA is, the RNA in the middle, the genetic material in the middle, is then going to be left without its membrane and its surface proteins. Remember, the surface protein was what allowed the virus to bind to a host cell, and the lipid membrane was what it used to merge with the cell to get the genetic material on the inside of the cell rather than the outside of the cell. So without that lipid membrane, we can't say that we've killed the virus because it was never alive, but what we've done is to render it inactive. It's no longer able to bind to a cell and to hijack the reproductive functions of the cell, because it's not able to merge with the cell to begin with. So in essence, not only does soap remove the virus from your skin, it also deactivates the virus and makes it incapable of binding to a host cell. In conclusion, soap is essential to controlling the COVID-19 global pandemic. Alcohol-based hand cleaner is also useful. The alcohol also has a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail, so it works similarly to soap to disrupt the lipid bilayer. But the health authorities that I have gotten information from all have recommended soap over alcohol-based hand cleaner. Alcohol-based hand sanitizer used only as a backup in case soap and water is not available. We may not be first responders to this global pandemic, but we're not just spectators. As makers of handcrafted soap, we have a role to play in controlling this pandemic. We're not just spectators, we're active participants in fighting this coronavirus disease. Finally, I miss you all. I really hate to be sitting here in an empty room in front of a laptop computer recording this message. And I hope to see you all in person at the 2021 annual meeting of the Handcrafted Soap and Cosmetic Guild. My name is Kevin Dunn. The book that I wrote for you guys is Scientific Soap Making. I hope that you're finding that useful as you go about your business making and creating handcrafted soap and cosmetics. Thank you.